Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We continue to work our way through this Penn State playoff game week, which will culminate noon on Saturday in Beaver Stadium with Penn State hosting SMU, a couple of 11-2 teams that are runner-ups out of their respective conferences. We will focus in on SMU for much of this episode a little bit later with a Mustangs insider who joins us fresh off his practice visit down there in Dallas. He has a lot to share with us about SMU's journey to this point and what they're bringing to Beaver Stadium. We will be back on the Penn State practice field Wednesday evening, late afternoon. Check out our coverage at lions247.com. We'll be keeping an eye out for player availability, who's operating out of practice, who's maybe missing from practice, and we'll get a chance to hear from James Franklin after this practice session as well to catch up on the latest in his team's preparation for their playoff debut. But we get it going on this episode with the transfer portal. We had Tyler Calvaruso on with us last Friday to kind of set the stage for the first big transfer portal weekend where we had guys visiting Happy Valley. We had offers going out there. We had a lot of mutual interest in place, and we're going to pick up and build off of that because not only did Penn State land its first commitment out of the transfer portal for the 2025 roster, but they are also making inroads for potential other pickups. And right now, we bring in Tyler Calvaruso, a resident recruiting and transfer portal insider from lions247.com. Tyler, always good to get you back on board.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back, man. We got a lot to get through. That's the deal every transfer portal season.
It's playoff week. There's so much fixation on what awaits this weekend and perhaps after. And Penn State could be playing for another month of playoff action. We just don't know quite yet, but not to be lost in the shuffle and certainly rearing its head in some ugly ways here in Happy Valley is the transfer portal and the fact that it is colliding with so much else happening in the college football world, the coaching carousel, bowl prep, playoff prep, and of course, National Signing Day is not that far in the rearview mirror. So much happening, but the importance here, and we spent a lot of time, Tyler, on our Monday episode of this podcast discussing the departure of Bo Perbula, the factors that led to that with the NCAA calendar and what's happening at quarterback for Penn State. And that was obviously a bit of a stinging loss for the Nittany Lions. Well-liked player, a guy who's made an impact on the field and an important backup for this Penn State roster. But on the positive side of the portal conversation is that Penn State is already getting started addressing its wide receiver spot for next season. And the first addition comes in the form of a opponent from this 2024 season, Kyron Hudson, veteran out of USC, spent several seasons there. This was his most productive. He had 4 catches and a touchdown in October against Penn State out in Los Angeles. He hit the portal not too long ago, and he is heading to Happy Valley in 2025. Tyler, what do we need to know about how things got to this point between Hudson and Penn State before we talk about the player himself?
Yeah, Penn State brought him in for a visit starting Sunday evening, and it didn't take long for those two sides to come together and mesh pretty well. Talking to people familiar with the process that Hudson went through, he felt pretty aligned with the Penn State staff and its plans for him on the field. And he liked the way the program operated and, the fact that it's going to be a serious college football playoff contender in 2025. That certainly did not hurt Penn State's chances, nor did the continuity of having Drew Aller back at quarterback in 2025 and offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki being back in 2025. All of that worked in Penn State's favor with Kyron Hudson. He has 1 year of eligibility remaining, and he's looking to make the most of it in an offense that could potentially play to his strengths. He felt that Penn State was that offense. That wasn't going to be his only visit going into his trip to Penn State. There were a couple of SEC programs involved. Duke was involved. They were all pushing for visits, but Penn State was able to lock this one down while Hudson was on campus, which is always a big deal in the transfer portal, more so than high school recruiting. Portal guys, it's probably more pertinent to close on them before they start traveling elsewhere because you just don't know what's going to happen. But from an on-field perspective, Hudson's a pretty high floor addition to this wide receiver room. He broke through and played a lot as part of a really talented USC wide receiver depth chart. They had a bunch of shortcomings this past season. Wide receiver was not one of them. Hudson was able to play a bunch. That should speak to the quality of the player and the quality of the addition for Penn State, the way I see it.
He was at 4 catches or more on 6 different occasions during the season for USC. I mentioned 4 catches, 36 yards, a touchdown against the Nittany Lions back in October. You go back to the season opener, a game that I think a lot of people were focused in on at that point. A few hours after Penn State put the finishing touches on West Virginia, you had LSU and USC going toe-to-toe, and he made, arguably one of the early catches of the year. I know it was a catch of the year candidate in week one, a one-handed grab going up top to grab the ball from Miller Moss. It helped lead to a go-ahead touchdown. It was crunch time. And Hudson's, you look across the kind of the sample size he posted this season, he only went over 60 yards a couple times, once against LSU, another against UCLA just a couple weeks ago. But he was a consistent factor, and he's a guy that we're going to work to get a little more intel on. We'll have a piece at Lions 24/7 this week as I've reached out to some connects out and cover USC who have been around that program during Hudson's career. So we'll have more feedback on that. But this was a guy who was in relative offensive obscurity for much of his career until 2024, Tyler. It's not like he had a major track record with the Trojans before this season. 17 catches, 189 yards last year with a couple of touchdowns. Didn't make much noise as an underclassman his first couple of years. The former four-star recruit. He's out of Mater Dei High School there in Southern California, which is where the Penn State just signed a really impressive cornerback in Darius Dixon. That's a pipeline you'd love to establish for Penn State because they've got multiple Power 4 conference recruits on an annual basis, but got a lot of pedigree to his history. Not a ton of performance production over his 4 years at USC, but you look very near in the rearview mirror. And obviously you like what you've got from him. And this is a USC offense that wasn't relying upon a top target for much of the season. So what do you kind of anticipate as he makes this transition to Happy Valley, where his fit is, and ultimately how much of a role he can get? We saw Julian Fleming transfer in this year, essentially be a fringe starter. He's been either the third or fourth piece for them. Not a lot of production there. Over the years, Mitch Tinsley has been the most productive transfer pickup. He was really solidly in their starting lineup a few years back as they made their way to the Rose Bowl. Do you see Kyron Hudson being somebody who works his way to the starting lineup by next September, or is more of a rotational piece?
Yeah, I could see that playing out. I think part of it depends on, what else Penn State does in the portal at the position. They're not stopping at just one wideout in this portal class. I think it goes into, any potential departures because you just don't know at this point in time. But yeah, I think that he could definitely work his way up and be a key part of the wide receiver rotation in 2025, maybe even as a wide receiver too. Penn State fans, and rightfully so, whenever they look at portal wide receivers, they want guys who are going to come in and be game breakers. I understand that. Hudson might not be that, but he could be a really solid addition to this wide receiver depth chart. He's good hands. He has the flair for the acrobatic catches down the field and coverage. That could always help bail your quarterback out. He has a lot of tools that can make him a valuable member of this wide receiver room. And he just did it this past season at USC. So you have a wideout who not just has the tools, but has shown he could separate against Power 4 and Big Ten cornerbacks. He's shown that he can run routes and get himself open against that level of competition. And that's a big plus because you don't have to worry about a guy jumping up in competition. He's been there, done that, has played in the Big Ten, knows what it's about. So I think if you're a Penn State fan, there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic about this get and what Hudson could add to that wide receiver depth chart in 25.
That's a good point because not all the receivers they've brought in have come from the Power 4 conference level. I mean, I mentioned Mitch Tinsley. He made a big impact after jumping up from the group of five, but we've seen a guy like Malik McClain who had some significant experience at Florida State. He was in the mix early in his Penn State career. He was out of the mix late, ultimately only spent 1 year here before transferring to Arizona State. And there was a lot of expectations for Dante Cephas making his move from Kent State. I think he was around 2,000 receiving yards in his preceding 2 seasons. In and out of the lineup, didn't finish the season on a good standing with this offense. And he was also a one-and-done player continuing his career at Kansas State. And when we look at Kyron Hudson, his 2024 totals, 38 catches, 462 yards, that both would have ranked third among all Nittany Lions this season. Of course, Tyler Warren is the top target in this pass attack. We'll see what it looks like next year when he's in the NFL and they've got new tight ends stepping up. Harrison Wallace was the leading receiver among Penn State receivers, 39 catches, 638 yards, 4 touchdowns. What really separates Wallace and Hudson when you look at their body of work in 2024 is that yards per catch, 12.2 yards per catch for Hudson this season. Harrison Wallace, about 16.5 yards per reception. And look, we know that Penn State's not done exploring options at wide receiver. We'll talk about a few more in a moment that they are looking at in the portal. But how would you kind of evaluate this initial pickup? There's been a lot of names that have surfaced early, Hudson's someone that has some established footing in the Big Ten Conference already. Would you say this is a really strong start, or is this maybe a supplemental piece that's being picked up early and you're looking for maybe the bigger piece down the road?
I think it's a solid start for sure. Penn State centered in on him as a top target pretty quickly. And I think anytime that happens in the portal, when you establish that pecking order and there were wide receiver names already on the board, then Hudson comes into the conversation a little bit later in the week, leaps some of those guys and works himself into the territory where, hey, look, we want this guy in our wide receiver and we're going to move on him. That speaks to the Penn State staff evaluation of Hudson and how they see him fitting. So I think it's a solid start. I don't think it's necessarily a get that's going to be saying, oh, wow, because like I said, the numbers are what they are. Hudson is who he is as a player. He's a good player. He's a good wide receiver. He's not necessarily a superstar who's going to, make your offense elite, or, he's not going to be one of those guys who comes in, catches 100, over 1,000 yards and double-digit touchdowns. That's fine, though. Not every receiver is going to be that in the portal. So I think it's a solid start to this transfer portal season for Penn State for sure. You could definitely do a lot worse at the position based on some of the guys out there. I can tell you that. And, this wide receiver group as a whole that's in the portal right now, it started out strong. I even took to social media to say I thought it was going to be a really strong group. Hasn't maybe quite reached that level yet, but Hudson, for my money, I think he's one of the better players out there wide out in the portal, and Penn State closed on him.
Hudson was a 4-star prospect coming out of high school, making his way to USC. He is the number 34 overall wide receiver in our 24/7 Sports transfer portal rankings to this point. One of the top 200 overall in the portal, regardless of position right now. Let's get over to different positions where Penn State's been poking their head in terms of the portal. And remember last year what they got out of the portal. I mentioned Julian Fleming. He's been one of the 4 primary receivers, but currently your starting cornerbacks are out of the portal. A.J. Harris, Jalen Kimber. Your starting right offensive tackle, Nolan Rucci, out of the portal. So we'll see what this means for Penn State down the road. These pickups could really pay big dividends as they try to get back to the playoffs next season. And a couple defensive tackles that we discussed last episode, Bear Alexander, David Blay, had visits lined up to Happy Valley. We've seen some videos and photo evidence now of what Bear Alexander might look like in a Penn State uniform. What do you make of where things stand now that we're a few days along in this process with Blay and Alexander? And as I said last episode, 2 very juxtaposed portal candidates here. In Blay, who signed with Division II Westchester out of high school, coming from Pennsylvania High School, went to Louisiana Tech, showed up as an all-conference player there, now trying to take another step up the ladder. And then Bear Alexander, big-time known recruit as a high school player, transferred a bunch in high school, has transferred a couple times now at the college level, hasn't found his footing, but everyone still sees his ceiling in place there.
Yeah, Alexander's going to head to Oregon this weekend, and I'm pretty interested to see how that visit's going to come together on a couple different fronts. He knows Dan Lanning from his high school recruitment at Georgia. He didn't get the chance to play for Lanning in Athens because Lanning left to take the Oregon job, but they're familiar. He knows the defense, knows the coach, so that always works out in the portal, and we all know what Oregon can do on the NIL front. Interested to see what Oregon places on the table in that regard and how it's structured. Alexander, his track record, it does not make him a sure bet for whichever program takes him in the portal. So that makes the NIL conversations a little bit more interesting. But, Mike Roach, our guy, 24/7 analyst who does excellent work in the Texas Midwest area, he caught up with Alexander's people post-visit, and it was a positive visit for Penn State. He gelled really well with the people inside of Lash. So that's a positive for Penn State there. And we're just keeping a really close eye and ear to the ground on where things go with that Oregon visit moving forward. And then with Blay, he made it to USC for his visit as expected. There's a chance at this final visit before he comes to a decision. There are other schools who have gotten involved late trying to push for a visit. So it's very much up in the air right now. What's not up in the air is Blay had a really good visit. Really like James Franklin, really like Deion Barnes, and just liked everything Penn State had to offer. So he's been to Penn State. He's been to Illinois. He's been to USC. Is that it? We'll see.
Blay was not a big-time name on the Pennsylvania high school scene, but another portal player that we've been monitoring certainly was. Anai White, he was considered a top 50 overall recruit at Imhotep in Philadelphia, where Penn State has signed several players over the years. He was the number 2 player in the state of Pennsylvania for that 2022 cycle, and he was a part of what was a really strong Texas A&M recruiting class, and that recruiting class has come undone over the years with guys hitting the portal, venturing elsewhere, and Nittany White has done that as well. What can you tell us about what has been a kind of a reunion of sorts? Penn State was, wanted to be a player in his recruitment. They did what they could. He ultimately headed south to the SEC. What do we make of round 2 of, quote unquote, this recruitment?
Now, Bear Alexander's visit wasn't the only one that was a feeling out process for both sides. There's a lot of that going on with Nittany White as well. And from everything we've gathered on our end, he checked all the boxes for Penn State while he was on campus, and things seem to go really, really well. I've heard a lot of positive things about Penn State's standing with Nittany White moving forward. And, if this one were to come together in Penn State's favor at this point, quite frankly, it would not surprise me based on the intel we have. He is familiar with Deion Barnes. Those two have a relationship dating back to before White went to college, from his high school days, with Barnes doing some training work with him on the side before he joined the Penn State staff as a grad assistant. So that's a long, long-standing relationship. And we always talk about how Penn State's going to go after guys they know well in the portal. White, he falls into that category, not just from the high school recruitment aspect of it, but the individual relationship with Barnes. That's, I would say, pretty notable in this situation. So, yeah, I feel pretty positive about this one from the Penn State side. And there's some good vibes in State College right now with Nittany White.
Imhotep, as I said, it's been good to Penn State. Jabri Wallace-Coleman, the running back, is the latest player to make his move from there. Last cycle, you got a couple guys from that program, and Kenny Wosley at cornerback and Tyseer Denmark at wide receiver. So certainly some history there, some trust in place, and now Nittany White after a couple of years at Texas A&M. Not very productive. A couple sacks is all he has to show for his time in an Aggies uniform, but still a developmental player more than what we would probably forecast as a plug-and-play, a big-time impact talent. But he's got some eligibility left, not just a one-year situation. That's a different situation for Kendall Daniels, linebacker from Oklahoma State. He is looking to finish out his college career in 2025. He's a guy that was a big-time player, number one player in the state of Oklahoma back in his recruiting class, productive player. He was a freshman All-American by a variety of outlets there, and played a bunch of football this year for Oklahoma State. He was 64 tackles, 10 and a half of them for loss, a highly productive player for the Cowboys, and it was a really rough year for that team. So where are we midweek between Penn State and Kendall Daniels? And it's, makes a lot of sense for linebacker to be an exploratory area for them, considering what we did not see in terms of depth from that position this year. And ultimately, you can probably poke holes in some of the performance across the starting lineup at various points of this 2024 schedule.
Yeah, good visit for him. Nothing is done yet as far as I've gathered, but it was a good visit. Penn State was one of the first programs to reach out to Daniels after he hit the portal. And, others have tried to get involved. Miami was one I know of that didn't really go anywhere. Penn State was able to get somewhere, get Daniels on campus for a visit. I don't believe it's his final visit. I don't have that concrete right now, but I believe he's going to get out and check out some other programs. But I think Penn State made a positive impression on Daniels, who I feel fits quite nicely in this defense, whether it be as a true linebacker in that hybrid role in Tom Allen's system. I think he could do a lot of different things for you with his athleticism, his ability to cover in space. He's a former safety. That's where he started his career before Mother Nature kind of took him in a different direction. He grew out of position, went on to play linebacker for Oklahoma State, but he's really athletic, can play sideline to sideline. So skill set wise, he makes sense as a fit at Penn State.
He's 6'4" too. So, there's length in play. And I know that Tom Allen, he likes those, guys with long levers who can run. And that kind of is what you're getting here with Kendall Daniels. Let's circle back to receiver and finish out this segment on the portal with you, Tyler Calvaruso, by going over a few names. Some of them, one of them at least, we discussed last week. A couple new additions, though, as we follow Penn State's monitoring of this wide receiver portal class. Justin Bowick from Ball State, Florida International's Eric Rivers, who we discussed last week, and then out of Virginia, Malachi Fields. So among those three, what can you tell us about them? Is there any kind of pecking order as you perceive it? And who do you think would be the most legitimate instant impact guy that you think you could hang your hat on, showing up to Happy Valley and having a role? Because you got a couple guys here who are trying to make the jump from group of five. another who had some history with your current wide receivers coach out of the Power 4 conference in the ACC?
It would definitely be Fields. We're talking about an all ACC wideout. And I wrote it this morning. He profiles as the kind of talent for a team that's competing for a national title, can maybe help get you over that hump at wide receiver. He's a really good player. He's coming off consecutive 50-plus catch seasons. He's one of the most productive receivers in the University of Virginia football program history. So the production is there. And again, you don't have to wonder about, his track record or, any of that Dante Cephas PTSD that Penn State fans have. You just don't have to worry about that. You've seen it year in and year out for him. And the connection is well documented at this point. Marcus Higgins offered him at Virginia. He recruited him to Virginia. He coached him up for a pretty healthy chunk of his career at Virginia. So it's a big time opportunity for Penn State and Higgins to go out and get an impact guy at the position. Now, it's not clear cut. It's not a done deal or anything like that. Notre Dame is going to be very aggressive, just like Penn State. Malachi Fields is going to have a market. There's no doubt about it. He's probably going to be one of the higher ranked receivers in the portal once our team at 24/7 gets to that point with him. And his market is very much going to be there. So it wouldn't surprise me if he gets out, make visits. I believe Virginia's trying to keep him on board still as well. So that's an element of this that you always have to follow. But would not surprise me if he gets out, takes a few visits. But Penn State's going to be aggressive here. There's no doubt about it. Down with the other two, Justin Bowick's arriving on campus Wednesday. Eric Rivers is going to be on Thursday. Bowick, I'm interested to see where things stand from an interest perspective on both sides after the visit. And with Rivers, I mean, if you look at what he accomplished at Florida International this past season, he's got the potential to come in and be a difference maker in a Power 4 passing attack. He's got speed. He's electric in the open field, can take the top off the defensive end, if asked, even if he's not the biggest guy in the world, that I believe 5'11", 174, so just shy of 175. But he has a skill set that I believe will translate no matter where he lands. And from asking around, I feel like Penn State has the chance to make a pretty strong impression on him. Fit is a really big deal with Eric Rivers. He's got 1 year of eligibility remaining. He wants to be in an offense that is really going to showcase his strengths. Play to his strengths, showcase his skill set, and, he wants to get to the NFL. He wants to be a productive wideout in a system that works for him, and there's a real chance Penn State could be that system.
Yeah, Rivers is a guy who was right around 1,200 yards this season, 12 touchdowns, 19 yards per catch for Florida International. You mentioned the size there. And by the way, when you're talking about Kyron Hudson, about 6'1", 205 pounds. Malachi Fields, not only does he bring that production, back-to-back seasons going over 800 yards for Virginia, he's 6'4", 220 pounds. Yeah. So that's a matchup issue downfield for you if you're able to Malachi Fields. And Bowick's a little bit different, 6'4" as well, but he made a move from Eastern Illinois up to Ball State. He has, through 3 college seasons, a maximum of 30 catches in a year. Feels like more of maybe a developmental kind of a grab if you're going to get Bowick. But, Fields, Rivers, the production's there. Fields has done it at the power conference level. We talked about his history with Higgins in that Virginia receiver room. It's back to his recruitment, and we'll see if that starts to surface as his process continues. You will be covering it all over at Lions247.com. I know there will be more names to get to next time we have you on the podcast, perhaps another commitment or two to discuss as well. Tyler, we appreciate all your hard work monitoring the portal and what Penn State's putting, the efforts they're putting in there, and we'll check back in with you real soon here on the podcast.
Thanks, man. Appreciate all your hard work. You guys have been killing it over there on the team side, so keep doing your thing.
This episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast continues with focus on Penn State's upcoming opponent, and it is a playoff opponent. Runner-up out of the ACC, 11-2 on the season. First year in the Power Conference setup, and here they come to Happy Valley on Saturday, the SMU Mustangs. We're going to get a really good perspective from one of the primary reporters for this program, Jacob Richmond, who does it for LoneStarLive.com, and he hops on the podcast with us right now. Jacob, really appreciate your time. We're very curious about an SMU team that this Penn State squad hasn't seen since the 1970s in a bowl game. So I know you've been probably cramming with the studying about this Penn State squad. We've been doing it the same thing about the team you cover. So this should be a big help for us, for our listeners, for our viewers. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, Tyler, thanks so much for having me on. I think everyone seems to be really excited for this matchup. I think it's maybe one of the more unpredictable ones for this first weekend. So, excited to break it down with you.
You're going to be making the trip up here, expecting to be very cold weather in Happy Valley on Saturday. It's been pretty cold around here lately. And I know it's probably low 70s as far as I could tell down in the Dallas area today. I mean, let's just get that out of the way. It's been a bit of a topic of conversation here, and it was really going to be whoever Penn State faced in the first round, as long as it wasn't a Big Ten opponent. Someone maybe going to unfamiliar weather territory. Is that something that you've heard from SMU over the course of this week as they near the kickoff? What can they do to prepare for that? Is there any concern about an impact on the program?
Yeah, I mean, personally, as someone who lived in Dallas most of their life, I'm not. I'm certainly going to be affected a little bit by the weather. But no, they've talked about it a little bit this week. Brett Lashley talked about it a lot today. He's like, I mean, listen, they're in playoff football. They just played a game in Charlotte where I think it finished at a low 30s. So they've certainly had some experience with the cold. I think the fact that it's a noon kickoff is going to be pretty beneficial for them. Sun's going to be out. They don't have to worry about, how chilly it gets at night. But if it's going to affect them, I think we'll know pretty quickly, but they're definitely not going to, the team's not going to let it be known that they're concerned about weather or anything like that. I think that they want to make sure they're locked in with what they're doing. So you maybe saw a couple plays in that ACC championship game where maybe the ball just hit the hand the wrong way and the cold did affect them. But if you look as the game got later, I mean, the receivers got crisper. So, it was getting colder and they didn't seem too bothered by it. So it's certainly a topic of discussion, but I'd be surprised if they let that be the reason that, they don't, compete in this game.
We'll see what the weather brings us. We know that the crowd's going to show up regardless. The anticipation, I'd guess, is going to be over 107,000 people in Beaver Stadium for this matchup Saturday at noon. They've called for a whiteout atmosphere. It's typically something that's been more of a primetime spectacle, but they're bringing it to playoff action for an afternoon game. SMU, about 32,000 seat stadium down there in Dallas. I know they've made their way around the ACC. They just played in a championship game for that conference title. But how do you think that they are in terms of preparedness for what awaits them from an atmosphere standpoint in Happy Valley?
Yeah, they certainly haven't faced anything quite like this. They've had some good experiences over the years. They went to Oklahoma last season, which I think is it's at least a little more comparable than say a Duke, which I do think is a unique atmosphere, but not more challenging than Penn State might be. They've talked about it this week, cranking up the sound when they're in the indoor facility. We've heard them playing Mo Bamba pretty much every practice at some point. But at the end of the day, it's another thing where I think, they're trying to be more focused on what they're doing. And the hardest part will, I think, just be making sure to hear the snap count from Kevin Jennings. I think otherwise, I mean, all year long, this team has talked about how much they love being the underdogs. They love going on the road, being in a hostile environment, and they've won, I think it's 11 straight road games now. So, they certainly haven't been fazed by like going to Louisville and places like that. So it's another one that like they have to get there and see how they react. That was what Coach Lashley said today is, listen, we don't know what it's going to be like when we get there. We're just gonna have to adjust to it. And if they don't, I mean, that could be a reason that things, don't go their way, but they've certainly been preparing for it.
This is a program at SMU, double-digit win total last year. They won their conference last year, but making the jump up to power conference play as an ACC member, a tricky situation in the opener. They were heavy favorite at Nevada, ended up getting out of there with a 5-point win. They beat up on Houston Christian the next week. No surprise against an FCS opponent. But then game 3, they suffer a loss against BYU, 18-15 on home turf. It ends up helping lead to a quarterback change, which we'll talk about in a moment. But at that stage, 2-1 before a matchup against TCU, which they did take, and then the entire ACC schedule. Can you talk us through maybe where the expectations were for this team in mid-September with that 2-1 record versus where they ultimately ended up 11-2 and nudging out, Alabama, a 3-loss Alabama to be that last at-large bid in the college football playoff?
Yeah, I think going into this season, people were maybe a little too skeptical of what SMU might be able to do. They brought back a lot of solid players and worked the transfer portal really well. But after those first 3 games, particularly that loss to BYU, I mean, it wasn't just the fact that they lost, it was the way in which they lost. Obviously, we know BYU ended up being a really solid team this season, but at the time, just the way they absolutely dominated what SMU's offense was doing, I think it did kind of start to turn what people maybe were expecting they could do. And they had a bye week after that BYU game. So they just sat in it, for basically 2 weeks. But as you alluded to, I mean, the quarterback change, there's some other things that happened in that bye week about settling in the O-line. I don't think it was something that we necessarily saw coming right out of that game. I think, you look at that game and you're like, hey, there were some issues there. It was still a very winnable game. The defense was phenomenal. The defense left no question that they could compete at a high level in that game, but it took off from that game. I feel like that was the real inflection point for this season, is what changes need to be made off of that game, and that included the quarterback switch and building more of an offensive identity around Kevin Jennings.
That was a matchup in which they did not get a touchdown. They got 5 field goals. They picked up a loss, and Preston Stone was the starting quarterback for that matchup, as he was for the first 2 games of the season. He was the starting quarterback last year, one of the premier prospects to ever sign with SMU from the high school level. And you look at his stats last season, about 3,200 yards, 28 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. But Kevin Jennings ultimately takes over in game 3, and he's the starter the rest of the way. So can you kind of talk us through maybe the preseason narrative about this quarterback position through those first 2 games? I know that Jennings was mentioned as somebody who was going to be involved, have some sort of role, but in terms of a total passing of the torch from Preston Stone, as I said, he's got quite a history with this SMU program. So for them to make that move when they did, why was it the choice, and what does it look like since then?
Yeah, so it goes all the way back, honestly, to last season. So Preston Stone breaks his leg in the regular season finale against Navy last year. They were well ahead in that game, on their way to an ACC championship appearance, and Stone goes down on his leg wrong, and he's done for the year. So Kevin Jennings steps in. He starts in the championship game, wins it, also makes an appearance in the Fenway Bowl for SMU. Then you start to get into the spring, and Preston Stone is going through his rehab. So he's not really with the team. He's off doing his own thing. Kevin Jennings is getting all these first team reps with the other players on the team. And I think that is something that maybe we didn't value enough kind of going into the season, because the coaching staff was letting it be known. They're like, hey, Kevin, he looks great. We think he's going to be in the mix here. So they had said it was going to be a quarterback competition. I think that a lot of us did think, hey, this is still Preston's team. He didn't show any reason not to, have him stick around. And I don't know if it's fair to say that he lost a step or anything off the injury. I think that especially the talent gap between AAC teams and ACC teams was a lot for the offensive line to deal with. That's why when in particular you get to that third game, to that BYU game, there was just no protecting him. Preston's good with his legs. He can move the pocket and, make more plays, but he's not really a threat to go downfield to try and rush for that first down, whereas Kevin is. And what you saw against BYU is that they had to respect that out of him. And he's just gotten better week in and week out since they made that quarterback switch. At the time, it made sense off of what we saw in that BYU game, because in the first 2 games, they looked pretty similar. Preston was maybe a little more effective against Nevada at the end of the game, but just with the way the offense was able to move when Kevin offers just more avenues for them to move the ball in a high tempo offense, he's really the more exceptional choice there. And he's really proven it. I mean, since then, once you make that switch, it's pretty much impossible for them to go back to Preston. And obviously it seems to have paid off big for them. Stone still come in and had some big moments against Louisville. Jennings had to go out for a play because he was getting checked on by the medical staff, and Preston came in. Instead of just hand the ball off, they said, hey, throw a pass. He throw a fade, and it was a perfect touchdown pass. So, I mean, he's still ready to go, but Kevin Jennings is the kind of player who people are saying it now could be in a contention for a Heisman if he keeps improving the way he is going to next year.
Yeah, redshirt sophomore status right now for Jennings, and he's a guy that, just coming off a press conference here on Tuesday with Tom Allen and some defenders. Clearly, there's a lot of attention on him right now in Penn State facilities. Tom Allen called him dangerous. Devontae Thomas, defensive tackle, called him a challenge. And Allen said he is every bit of a dual threat. He can run it, he can throw it, and everyone seemed to say he's at his most dangerous when it's time to create or improvise. It's not necessarily taking off downfield and picking up 10 yards. It's buying some time, evading the pass rush, and then finding a secondary target down the field, one of those back-breaking type of plays for a defense. So when it has gone right for Jennings, just how has it looked? And when you look at this, challenge for him going up against Penn State's defense, 20-degree weather here in Beaver Stadium, what do you make of that opportunity and that test for Kevin Jennings?
Yeah, what I think has been most interesting to watch about him this year is he started with it was making those it was scrambling and picking up those first downs with his legs, but as you've watched him get more comfortable over the course of the year, he's extending plays, he's looking for that second opportunity, he's making the big throw. I think that's where you're starting to see the difference between a really good quarterback and the kind of quarterback who could win, who could be winning playoff games, who could be beating elite teams. So I think it's a lot of him. A lot of it is just him staying calm, staying poised. His vision's exceptional. There are so many plays where you see him put his head down where he's trying to avoid a defender. He'll pop his eyes up and the ball's out within a second. So being able to make those plays, having the ability to go and make those plays is really important. As you mentioned, Penn State's defense is definitely a new beast compared to anything else that he's faced this season. Guys like Abdul Carter are probably not going to give him as many of those opportunities. And that's where I think is the really interesting story for this game is just how much pressure can they apply to him. He's good against the blitz. He's good when people are pressuring him. But if you have elite, defensive playmakers, they're going to make those plays before he maybe even has the chance to. I think the other big thing for him is just limiting turnovers. I think you saw it in the ACC championship game. And it was really the difference was that he had those early mistakes. And when those happen, he's good at not making them spiral, but good teams also take advantage of those things, as you saw Clemson do in that game. Going back to his worst game against Duke, he had 5 turnovers. Still were able to ride the defense to a win there, but it took him a little longer to respond in that one. Since then, he's been much better, and he's very, very good at kind of hitting the reset button and not really dwindling on a poor performance. So I'm very interested to also see how he comes out of a performance where first half it was pretty rough, second half it was great. Is he going to carry that over against Penn State, or is he going to have to find his footing again like he did in the championship game?
In terms of a supporting cast on offense, just reviewing the stat sheet a little bit, 10 different SMU players have a reception of 30-plus yards this season. 7 different SMU players have at least 20 catches on the season. I know that they've got a dual threat at running back essentially as well. And Brashard Smith, what he's done as a runner, 1,200 yards on the ground, as a receiver, 35 catches on the year. Can you kind of describe to us what the supporting cast looks like, who the biggest threats are, and also how's the offensive line handling its end of the bargain, and how does that shape up against this Nittany Lions defense?
Yeah, I think that it's been really interesting to watch because when you think of SMU football over the last couple of years, you think a lot about those big receivers, your James Prochet's, your Rashee Rice's, your Cortland Sutton's, and the last year or two, it's really been the complete opposite. There's no number one guy. There's no one you're like, hey, this guy's going to get 6 catches every game, and that's going to be it. It's been complete opposite. One of the guys who's kind of progressing that way was RJ Maryland at tight end, but he suffered a season-ending injury midway through the year. So what we've been seeing is Kevin Jennings really getting comfortable with a little bit of everyone, which makes it kind of hard to pin down who is going to be the important one to follow. I think they've done a really good job of mixing it up, that some games it's Keyshawn Smith, who's always a really big target to try and outpace his defensive back and make a big play. Jordan Hudson's a great guy in man coverage. He's tall. He's got a good vertical. He's definitely someone to watch out for. Roderick Daniels Jr. is one of the most versatile players in all of college football. He's played receiver, he's played running back, he even blocks, and he's not a big guy. And it's impressive how he can still pick up some of these linebackers and make enough of a push that Kevin Jennings can go make a play. And then, as you said, Brashard Smith, he's one of my favorite stories from the team this year. Hadn't played running back since Pee Wee football. He spends his time at Miami. Obviously, the SMU coaching staff, many of those coaches recruited him and worked with him before they headed SMU. And he was interested in jumping in the portal. They were like, hey, we don't have a spot at receiver. Like, sorry. But he was really adamant, and the running back coach, Kyle Cooper, was like, hey, what if we had him do like what Isaiah Pacheco essentially does over with the Chiefs? And since then, he's done nothing but, rush for 1,200 plus yards and become an all-conference running back. He's a really exceptional athlete and the kind of player that SMU really loves, which is just someone who will do special things when the ball is in their hand. You'll see a lot of their players are like that. So they don't care about the size, about the, particular athletic archetype. They're just worried about who's going to make a play when we give them the ball.
And we have heard a lot about this offense over the years at SMU, but it's their defense in this transition that, it really stood out to me a little bit in reviewing their path to this point. Number 2 ranked in the conference for yards allowed per game, and where they've really excelled and where they led the ACC this season is against the run. 93.5 yards allowed through these first 13 matchups. And I look at what Penn State's done lately. For the last 5, they've gone over 200 yards on the ground. They went for almost 300 rushing yards against Oregon in the Big Ten championship. So it seems to be a strength on strength scenario there that we're going to see on Saturday. What is the overall story on this defense? Why have they been so crisp against the run? And kind of the same deal I asked you on the offense. Who are the playmakers who can maybe swing momentum on any moment?
Yeah, I'm really excited to watch how SMU's run defense goes up against Nick Singleton, Kiron. I think that it all comes back to defensive coordinator Scott Simons. He's been a really huge part of SMU's success over the past couple of years. When you kind of take over a defense, and they've talked about this a lot, when you take over a defense, sometimes you're tempted to go and play a style of defense with the players that you have available. I think from the beginning, they were kind of like, hey, let's try and play the defense that we want to play. Very fundamentally sound, focused on tackling, focusing on finishing plays. And the first year, they still ranked, I think, in the bottom 40 or 50 in the country in terms of scoring defense. But as SMU's been able to bring in more talent through the transfer portal with their move to the ACC, getting to attract players who are just at another caliber of what they've been able to have on defense before, it's lended itself really well to bring in these guys who do that fundamental stuff really, really well. And then Simons is able to scheme really interesting stuff. One of my favorite quotes that Brett Lashley always said is that he calls a defense like an offense. He's looking for ways to attack the offense. He's not looking to react per se, even though that is typically how you would call a game defensively. And it's led to just a unit that's so sound in that front seven that it's been really hard to crack. The teams that do the best at it have been the ones that are doing so well in the passing game that it forces them to kind of commit numbers back. The real playmakers in the unit, Elijah Roberts is number 1. He's one of their edge rushers. I think he's one of the more underrated defensive players in the country. I think he's 5th in quarterback pressures, and he's missed a game and played a game with a cast on his hand after breaking his index finger. He's just really explosive, and they're a unit that doesn't even blitz a lot and still know how to get quarterback pressure pretty consistently. In the secondary, you're looking at a couple of really great leaders, and Jonathan McGill and Isaiah Wacobia, both safeties, guys from the area. Wacobia has been at SMU since high school, and McGill transferred after a couple of years at Stanford. And just the way they're kind of the ones who run the defense a lot of the time and know how to make big plays. It's a defense that has a pretty good interception count, but I'm not, you don't really anticipate that every single game. It's really just about where they're moving around and going to make plays. Because the secondary is a little undersized, I think. It's maybe on the paper one of their weaker units, but they really play up to whatever opponent they're against. And then one last player to mention is a linebacker, Kobe Wilson. He's one of the top tacklers on the team. Just a ridiculous motor on him. He had I think an 80-yard pick six early this season that I remember Rhett Lashley saying was the best defensive play he's ever seen in his life. Definitely encourage anyone to go and look at that. He's an exciting player and interested to see what he does at another big game.
Two aspects of this matchup I don't want to overlook. We always try to get to this on our podcast. Look ahead to the next opponent, special teams and lingering injury issues. I know you talked about RJ Maryland, who got off to a really hot start at tight end for SMU, being out for the season. Are there some injury concerns that maybe on a Tuesday here of game week, you're not quite ready to know what it's going to look like on Saturday. And additionally, special teams. What do we need to know about that unit for SMU? I took a quick look, and it looks like they are not shy about trotting out kicker Colin Rogers for long field goals. 8 of 10 from 40 to 49, 7 of 11 from 50 plus on the season. So 15 makes from 40 plus yards. Tell us a little bit about that unit and about any potential health issues.
Yeah, starting with special teams. Yeah, Colin Rogers. He's been a great story this year. He set the program record for scoring this year, passing up Eric Dickerson and Doak Walker in one kick. It was pretty crazy to think of a guy passing those two greats. But last year he struggled a lot at the beginning, but really settled in, and he was huge for them winning their conference championship last year. Like, he had 4 or 5 field goals. He was definitely on it. This year, I think you look at like the amount of misses he has, and they're a little misleading. I think he's come in anytime they've needed a field goal and been able to deliver. And yeah, I mean, he's hitting 55, 56 yarders pretty consistently. So I'm interested to see how the wind may factor into how much they use him and how much he's able to do. But yeah, if they need a clutch field goal, he's the kind of guy you want to deliver it. In terms of a return game, you'll see Roderick Daniels Jr. and Brashard Smith on punts and kick returns, both pretty experienced with that. I think Roderick's probably the one more likely to break out a big game. With Brashard, he returns like he did at Miami, but I feel like, he takes a lot of hits, so I feel like they try not to send him too much downfield. They don't return, I think, quite as many kicks as maybe your average team. And then talking about injuries, they're actually in a pretty good spot right now. They've lost a handful of players over the course of the year. RJ Maryland was one, Jake Bailey, key receiver. They lost 2 running backs who are a big part of their rotation early on. But as far as like smaller lingering things, they haven't had too much to worry about. Cornerback Jalen Davis Robinson, he missed the ACC championship game, but he is expected to be back. So that's really the only one we've been monitoring at this point. There could be another, surprise. You never know. I don't think they're trying to keep it pretty tight-lipped when stuff like that comes up. But it's been a really good season for them that they haven't had too many lingering things, affecting who's available, who's not. And they've actually been getting players back. Like Romello Brinson is a receiver who he missed, I think, 5 or 6 games with lingering bursitis, but he made his kind of re-debut against Clemson, had a couple catches, and he's expected to be back for Penn State as well.
Let's finish here, Jacob. It's still fairly early in the week. You're not quite ready to get on a plane and head north yet, but as we dial it up and start to try to figure out what's going to happen Saturday between noon and 3 o'clock here in Happy Valley, what's your forecast? And feel free to change it over the course of the week. Feel free to ditch this one if you want, but do you have a score prediction in mind here as we record on a Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, this is one that I genuinely could see going a lot of different ways, because I think SMU's never, like I said earlier, never really been challenged in this way. This is a kind of elite level team that they've really never faced before. But there was things that were encouraging in that Clemson game that, if as long as they don't have that poor start, you really think it could be a close game. I don't remember exactly what the line is, but I think I'd probably
8.5 is where we checked on it today. Yeah.
I'd probably say that I'd still think Penn State's probably going to win this one, but I think it'll be somewhere between 3 and 6 points. So I'd probably go like kind of similar to the championship game, like a 31-28, something like that. SMU typically does really well when they score 30 plus points. In fact, the Clemson game was one of just 2 times that SMU's lost in a last year while scoring 30 plus points. So I think that it'll be kind of up to Penn State to keep them below that total. Yeah, it's a tough one. I'll be honest, I don't know if I can stay married to that prediction, because it's one of, I think, the hardest ones to call of the weekend.
I'm with you. It's going to be fun to sit down in the press box and actually get to see these 2 teams go toe-to-toe. But that's the beauty of the playoff. You're bringing 2 opponents who had really good seasons, feel really good about themselves, and you let them share a field and figure out who gets to go off to the Fiesta Bowl and play Boise State. Well, we really appreciate it. Jacob Richmond, you can catch his content on SMU all week long leading up to this matchup at LoneStarLive.com. And he's fresh off of his media availability. I know he's got a chance to talk to some Mustangs player on Wednesday. So we're all hustling and bustling on our respective campuses right now. And we'll see you at the finish line in the press box on Saturday. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. Big appreciation to Jacob for laying out all that on the SMU Mustangs before they come up to campus. Before that, you heard the latest on Penn State's transfer portal explorations and a first commitment of this period from Kyron Hudson. We'll break down whatever else pops up in the transfer portal over at Lions247.com, and we'll get Tyler Calvaruso back on the podcast again soon to sort through the latest. For now, stepping aside, we're back with another episode later this week following our visit to the practice field and another opportunity to hear from James Franklin, Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen, and myself. We'll be back with you, episode 3, predictions and players to watch and everything else that we can offer you from Happy Valley. For now, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.